started from the Boltzmann equation for the photon distribution and tried to basically evaluate the collision term as well as the different term describing the propagation of the photon at linear order in perturbation theory. Like this. And so what did we find? So what we found is that if we restrict ourselves to linear perturbation, then for the coordinate velocity of this light beam, it's enough basically to take the zeroth order contribution, because this is this gradient here is 0 at the unperturbed level. For the change of momentum, however, we need to be more explicit. So here we have three contributions which we discussed. The redshift of the momenta, change in the potential, and then redshift, blue shift when you go through towards or outward a density perturbation. And then we also evaluated the collision term. So let me write it here. In some details. So we introduced the Compton, Thomson optical depth per unit time, and then we also introduced this fractional temperature perturbation, theta, and so we have the monopole here, which represents the scattering of photons into the beam, which propagates along this direction and at. Then there is the scattering of photon outside the beam. So and there is a Doppler contribution, because electrons and photons do not necessarily move with the same velocity. Okay. And then one last thing, since the photon energy density goes like the temperature to the 4, right? It's a black body. Then the fractional, so the monopole of the fractional temperature perturbation is actually 1/4 of the fractional photon density perturbation. So now we want to put all this together. Into this equation there, and so at first order, what we have is the following. So the Boltzmann equation reduces to So what I did here is that, so for the third term here in the left-hand side, okay, the change of momenta. So if I consider only the background contribution, the minus h, which is the redshift of momenta, then basically I can multiply it by the distribution function up to first order term included, while obviously since these changes, they are from the gravitational potential, they are first order in perturbation, then they need to multiply the homogeneous and isotropic distribution function. Okay, so I split this term into these two contributions so that things are done consistently at first order. So let's look first of all at the zeroth order. So in this case, the photon distribution is just the background homogeneous and isotropic distribution. So then there are only two terms which contribute at zeroth order. So this one and that one, and there is no collision because everything here is first order in perturbation. So this implies okay, that's nothing but just phase space conservation with the redshift of momenta. So it follows from the fact that this is a function basically of A times P. Okay? Where P is the physical momentum. We know it decays as 1 over A. So what you have here is like basically a black body distribution of photons which propagate freely. There are no collisions, no interactions. Their momenta are all redshifted as 1 over A. So if you start with an initial black body shape, you end up, as you evolve, you always have a black body shape, except that basically all the distribution is shifted towards lower momenta. Okay? So basically the effective temperature, because now it's an effective temperature, there are no collisions, right? So there is no thermodynamic equilibrium at this level. Right? So the temperature is just a parameter, but basically this temperature parameter redshifts also as 1 over A, okay, equivalently. So the CMB blackbody radiation at which of approximately 3000 Kelvin at recombination at redshift 1000 and ends up with also blackbody radiation today at 3 Kelvin. That we know very well. So now let's look at the first order term. So for the first order term, we need to do a bit of massage of this equation. So let's first write it down. So what do we need? So now we change. So we consider F gamma is the background plus the perturbation to the distribution function. And so this perturbation to the unperturbed distribution is defined as, how did I define it? Minus P, df by, if I remember. Yeah, minus P. Times the fractional temperature perturbation. So this implies that from this equation, then we need to keep the following term. Okay, then we have this term. And then we keep here the potentials. And then on the right-hand side, we have the collision term. Okay? So, that's the first term, and actually the only term we just need to change a bit. So let's do the calculation. So this is by definition this. Okay, and then we use the fact that, so we take advantage of the fact that, remember, the fractional temperature fluctuation is achromatic, right? It does not depend on the momenta of the photons, because they are all basically changed in the same way. So we have the following then. So we have, so this is minus P dp. So then we do df gamma dt bar, t bar dot theta, and then we have minus P df gamma dp theta. Okay? Well, I use the fact that f gamma bar is 1 over AP divided by T bar minus 1. Okay. And then from this I also infer that the derivative of f gamma bar with respect to the temperature is actually minus P divided by this average temperature times the derivative with respect to P. And so that brings it into the form, then minus HP ddP times P df bar P theta, right? Minus P dP theta. Sorry, there was a theta dot, so it was a derivative with respect to time. Yeah. Okay. And this term, actually, I can rewrite it as follows. Minus P df bar dP theta h. And you see that this is nothing but actually from the definition of what is the perturbation to the photon distribution function. This is basically plus HP d delta f gamma dP. So it will exactly cancel that term. Okay? Huh? So then you just substitute. Okay, so this piece will cancel that piece. So then it's very simple. So you will have, okay, maybe one last thing. So this term also, so let's do it like that. So we had this, sorry. So we have this here, and then let's also look briefly at the gradient of f gamma. So d dx of delta f gamma, this is d dxi of minus p d f bar dp theta, and obviously this is just minus p df bar dp times the gradient of the temperature fluctuation, which is, I mean, this is where the only dependence on x is, okay? So you see that basically you will have everywhere factors of minus p times grad f gamma bar p, okay, in front of all of these terms. Just take them out, and you get to an equation for the fractional temperature fluctuation. Okay, but simply substituting all this and doing this simplification. And so the equation is So once you divide by this minus p grad p of f gamma bar, then you get, so that's what at least I find. Okay, minus okay, so in the left-hand side, you have the usual directional derivative along the beam, the light beam, okay, which is basically a straight line in our approximation. It's like Born approximation. So a straight line towards the observer at the origin of coordinates, okay? And then on the right-hand side, you put all the perturbation, okay, which we evaluate along this straight line trajectory. So you have the contribution from the potential, and then you have the collision term. And then, so for the collisions, really, you just care about how many photons are injected into the beam and how many are scattered out of the beam. But those who are scattered out of the beam, obviously, you don't care what will happen to them. Okay, you really just follow what's happening to the beam, okay, along this straight line trajectory until it reaches you at the origin of coordinate. Okay. So now, how do you go further? So at this stage, you do the following. It's because you are at linear order, you go to linear order in perturbation theory. The Fourier mode of all these perturbations evolve independently. And so what you will do is Fourier transform, Fourier decomposition. And then you will basically look at this equation, but in Fourier space. Okay, so let's do the Fourier decomposition. So we need some convention. So this is my convention. So let's start with the gravitational potential. So I write the gravitational potential in configuration space as the following. So I put the factor of 2 pi here. 2 pi cube with the Fourier space volume element. So k and x are 3 vectors, huh? Okay? So what does this mean is that if you do the inverse Fourier transform, then you will have an integral over x, and in this integral over x, then there is no factor of 2 pi cube, okay? It appears here. Okay, we go the same for the second potential. So now the fields at coordinate time eta and position x, they are described as a superposition of plane waves. Okay, with amplitude psi eta k or phi eta k. Okay. Now let's look at the. So let's look at the baryon velocity. So these are two scalars, so there was not much of an issue here, but the baryon velocity is a 3 vector, and if you remember, we discussed this scalar vector tensor decomposition. So this. So VB of baryons could, in principle, you would decompose it into gradient piece and the rotation or divergence-free piece. Obviously, since we are only considering scalar fluctuations, what we need to focus on is this scalar type vector contribution to the baryon velocity. Okay, so it can be written that the gradient of some potential. Okay, so it's convenient to proceed as follows. So to write, so I want to express this as the Fourier transform of some gradient. So let me put write it here, okay, in front. And so I will basically define the Fourier mode of this function here from which I'm taking the background, the gradient, sorry, as follows. So I introduce an extra factor of 1 over k, and the only reason is to have the units of this like velocity potential be units of velocity, which means dimensionless in natural units, okay? I don't want to introduce any scale here. So if you do that, okay, so that's basically the velocity potential of the baryon. Then you get minus I. Now if you act with the gradient operator here, k hat VB k. Sorry, there is obviously eta k, which I forgot to write in my notes. Okay? And then I also added a minus sign just for, well, just to match convention of some people in the literature, okay? I will give you actually a list of references of papers and reviews where you can look at this in more detail. And then you do the same with the fractional temperature to the photon distribution. So we'll write it as, so now you have to be a bit careful. You have 3 variables, but remember, I mean, n hat is absolutely not connected with x. So I just described the direction of propagation of this light beam, okay, but it's completely independent of x, okay? So I just do the Fourier transform on x independently of n, okay? So here again, now I defined so now the Fourier transform of this fractional temperature perturbation basically will also depend on eta, but also depend on n. Okay, I just switched the configuration space coordinate for the Fourier space wave mode k. Okay. And so now what I will define additional variable, which I call mu, and mu will be the cosine between the direction of propagation of the beam and the wave mode k. Okay, so it's the following quantity. Okay. Then this implies that, for instance, if I'm calculating this okay. Okay, so when I will act with the gradient on the Fourier expression, I will bring down the factor of ik, and then when I take the scalar product of this ik with n, then I will bring a factor of mu from the definition, right? So I will get ik mu, where k here is the modulus of the wave mode, okay, times theta okay. That was the only basically subtlety here, because for all the other terms, basically you don't have much to do, right? There is no gradient, nothing. So then you just take the Fourier transform of all this, okay? Or if you prefer, you express all these terms as the Fourier transform, okay? And then you have this integral over all something that depends on k, eta, and possibly n hat times e ikx. What is there inside this integral is basically our Boltzmann equation, but in Fourier space. Okay? And so it is, so you get to this, theta dot plus I k mu theta, which comes from this term, equals minus I k mu psi. Okay, so that's because there was also a gradient here, so same story actually. Okay, plus phi dot plus the collision term. And then, yeah, there is also there is another scalar product here. Okay, so that gives I mu VB. Okay. So with the understanding that they are all Fourier space. Okay, so there are all these variables are function of eta and k, except for the temperature perturbation, which is a function of eta, k, and at. Okay? So it's not yet the end, because now what you do is, in order to solve this equation, is to decompose the temperature fluctuation, the Fourier mode of the fractional temperature fluctuation in multipoles. So basically, you don't want to have here a function of 3 variables, but you want to work with basically 2 variables, and this, okay, this basically you want to recast into like basically a Legendre multipole expansion. And so you define, so these multipoles, we will write them like this, where L is the multipole, function of eta and k, and they are defined as follows. So you write theta, eta, k, and at as, so that's a certain convention. So it's minus I, L, theta L, eta K, and then you have the angular dependence here. PL, K scalar N at, okay, where PL of X, they are Legendre polynomials. So the first, so you have P0 is 1, P1 is X, P2 is 1/2 of 3x squared minus 1. Okay. And then once you have done this, well, you will start taking moments of the Boltzmann equation. Now you will take moments of these equations, and what you will see is the following. So you will basically, by taking moments, you will end up with a hierarchy of differential equations for the multipole theta L, and because of this term, which has a mu here, which is P1 of mu, you will basically always couple any multipole theta L to the next theta L plus 1 multiple. Okay? So what you do is basically you multiply by the given Legendre polynomials, you do the averaging over mu, and then you get an equation for the L multiple. And so if you do this for, let's say, the first 2 multipoles, you get for the lowest order multipole, let's put it like that. So you get the following. So for the monopole, the equation is okay. Sorry, it's phi dot. And for the dipole, okay, so you see, for equation for the monopole involves the dipole involves the quadrupole would involve the octopole, etc., etc. Hexadecapole. So it's a coupled, it's a hierarchy of coupled differential equations. It's called the Boltzmann hierarchy. So typically, if all these multiples are important, then you have to solve this numerically, right? I mean, you can find some approximation, but maybe one last thing. So the quadrupole, let's say maybe something about the quadrupole. So the quadrupole, what does it represent physically? So, okay, you sit at a certain point, okay? You observe the photon distribution function. You see like a monopole. You see dipole, you see quadrupole fluctuation. And these quadrupole fluctuations, physically, they arise when the photon mean-free path becomes significant relative, let's say, to the typical scale of a fluctuation. So basically, okay, if the photon and baryon fluid is very strongly coupled, then the photon that I would see from this position, at this position, okay, in space and time, the photon that I would see here and from which I would construct the local photon distribution function, they would all come from a region which is very close to me, okay? Because they have to be scattered, I mean, just shortly before I observe them, right? Because there are many, I mean, the limit of very tight coupling, so there are many scattering between photons and electrons. So in this case, basically, they will all have approximately the same temperature plus a dipole, so there is no quadrupole. Okay, so the quadrupole, you will start building up. The mean-free path of the photons becomes large. Okay, in which case, when you do the averaging here to construct the distribution function, you start seeing photons which comes from different regions with different temperatures. Okay, here it could be hot, here also hot. Here it could be cold, okay? And so, I mean, if there is a quadrupole, okay, basically in the distribution of the temperature of the surrounding regions, then you will observe this also here in the, okay? So that's what's happening. So when the mean-free path is basically very short, the quadrupole is 0, and basically you can truncate the hierarchy, okay, at the dipole level. And generically, if the mean-free path is large, then you have to consider actually all the higher order multiples. And because as soon as you have a quadrupole, because these equations are coupled, it will propagate into the higher order multiples. Okay. So what really matters, okay, so that you have two limits: tight coupling, very short mean-free path. You can truncate. You're in some sort of fluid approximation, right? You just need basically, it's essentially energy and momentum conservation, okay, without here the quadrupole. Or you have to solve the full Boltzmann hierarchy. Yeah. So this being said, what about baryons then? Okay. So I won't do there is no point doing the whole calculation. You can also start from a Boltzmann equation for baryons, but I mean, fortunately, because electrons are very strongly coupled to protons through Coulomb scattering, they basically, I mean, the fluid description is very good, okay, for the baryons. So it is enough, basically. I mean, what I mean is that the mean free path is extremely short between two Coulomb scattering events, okay? Extremely short. So you are in the case where basically it's enough to consider a density and a bulk velocity for the baryons, okay? So you only need the fractional density perturbation to the baryon, okay, so the Fourier modes for this scheme, okay, and also the velocity potential of the baryons, okay, that's enough. And so you have basically essentially fluid equations, and which I would just write down. So if you would do the calculation, and basically you would end up with the following. So for the monopole, okay, to some extent that's what you get. And then for the velocity, so that's momentum conservation, you get where R is so you also have, so here also you have a momentum exchange term because of Compton scattering. So you have also here this momentum exchange term, okay, in the baryon, because baryon and photons exchange locally momentum and energy, right? On average not. And what is important to note here is that, I mean, naively, you would expect that, why do I have, you see, R goes, so this 1 over R goes like 1 over the baryon density. What I mean by baryons, I mean electrons and protons. Why not just electrons? The reason is that electrons and protons, they are very strongly coupled through Coulomb scattering, right? So basically, if you want, you don't transfer momentum just to electrons, you transfer momentum to electrons and protons, right? If you want to move an electron, if you want, you will have to move the proton that goes with it, right? So basically, the transfer is suppressed here by 1 over the baryon density. So basically, if I would take the proton mass to go to infinity, then this would just be 0. I would not be able to basically move the electrons, okay? Because they are so strongly coupled to the protons. Okay? And then finally, I mean, what you also need to consider is cold dark matter, nonetheless. Because it's actually a very important ingredient, although it does interact only gravitationally, it contributes to most of the potential, right, in matter domination. So for the baryons, basically, the same story will, for the cold dark matter, the same story applies. Okay, so obviously dark matter is collisionless, so it's not a fluid. So you would have to solve the full Boltzmann hierarchy, but because we are talking about cold, so non-relativistic dark matter, the higher moments, okay, of the dark matter distribution function that goes with powers of the momentum or the velocity, they're suppressed by powers of V over C. So you can basically neglect them in the non-relativistic limit, and so you end up also with two equations which represent energy and momentum conservation. So for cold dark matter, and then what you also have is, so this, and okay, and so what next? Well, what next? What is next? You will do basically this afternoon in the exercise session. So what you will do is that, so we will forget about cold dark matter. We just look at the photon baryon fluid, and you will solve these equations in the so-called tight coupling limit. So this goes back to what I just explained, right? So basically, you have basically essentially two scales, okay, which you need to consider. First, you have tau c dot minus 1, which is basically the time or the mean free path, okay, of the photons. And then you have basically k minus 1, which is the typical co-moving length, okay, of a perturbation with wave number k. So that would, okay. Now the tight coupling limit so you are in the tight coupling limit when basically the mean free path is much, much shorter than the size of this perturbation. So what does this mean? That this means that the photons and the baryons really behave as a fluid, right? As a single fluid. Basically, I take one of these fluid elements here. Okay, it's going to move like there after some time. What are the photons doing? The photons, they do a lot of scattering, but they do it along, right? They really closely track the motion of the fluid element. Okay? In the opposite limit, they would basically just free stream out of this element, and then the full approximation would completely break down. Okay? So that's the tight coupling. Tight coupling means single fluid. Okay? But you see, obviously, that so this criterion depends on scale. So k minus 1 is basically L in configuration space. So it's gonna work very well when you look at large scales, right? Because the photons, I mean, are not going to move much relative to this big scale. But as you start looking at smaller and smaller scales, this approximation will break down. Okay? So at small scales, the approximation breaks down, and you start generating a quadrupole, which propagates into higher order multipoles. And basically what this means physically is that you start dissipating energy. So long as you're in the tight coupling limit, you have a perfect fluid, no dissipation. But as you start looking at small scales, you build up a quadrupole because nonetheless the photon mean free path is small but non-zero, and then you start dissipating energy. There is viscosity. Okay? Okay, so I think I will stop here with this chapter. So maybe you want to, or you're fine? Want to have a 5 minutes? Or we move on? If you promise me you're back in 5 minutes. Okay, so let's go on. So I thought of the following. So since you have next week lectures also on neutrino physics, I thought it might be useful to tell you, okay, so how do neutrino contribute and affect the evolution of fluctuations in particular? But I will start with a review of what they do at the homogeneous and isotropic level before discussing a bit perturbations. And then gradually I will move to the, large-scale structure and nonlinear growth of what is so far just linear perturbation theory. So I thought, first of all, maybe some of you know, maybe some of you don't, just go a bit through the expansion history from the point of view of neutrinos. So first of all, since at low redshift they are the only basically, so I will assume at the moment that they are massless, okay? But they have a mass. This, I guess, I don't want to discuss this too much because this very likely will be discussed in a lot of details next week. So let me just at the moment assume that they are massless. Okay, so in which case, photons and neutrinos are the two relativistic particles left today. So it's convenient to define the density of relativistic radiation, which consists of photons and neutrinos. So at the moment, all this discussion is at the background homogeneous and isotropic level, okay? And so this is can be written as follows. Okay, so T gamma is the photon temperature at some coordinate time T nu neutrino temperature. Nu is the number of neutrino families. Okay, well, number of neutrinos, okay, so basically it's approximately 3, okay, as far as we know today, okay. And so if you assume that the neutrinos are massless, then both the photon and neutrino temperature decay as 1 over A. So then I could rewrite this radiation energy density, which is a function of A, as follows. This is gamma 0. It's the temperature of the photons today. This is the temperature of the neutrinos today. And here you have the usual scaling a to the minus 4 as is appropriate to relativistic particles. The factor of 7, 8, it would arise if when you do the integrals over the distribution function, when you have fermions or bosons, you have this slight difference. So So that's because neutrinos are fermions, right? And photons are bosons. Okay. Just about the neutrino masses now. The sum of neutrino masses, this will be explained next week again, what do we mean by neutrino masses also precisely, okay? It's constrained to be larger than 0.06 eV from solar oscillations, measurement, etc., etc. Okay? So actually, the bottom line is that because of this, the scaling temperature of neutrinos goes like 1 over A is actually only valid so long as the temperature of the neutrinos is, larger than their mass. Okay? So the first thing that I want what I want to do here is, to discuss, okay, how does the neutrino evolve? How do they interact with the plasma or do not interact with the plasma? What do they do, okay, at the homogeneous and isotopic background? And in particular, okay, calculate the temperature of this neutrino background today. Okay? So in the early universe, neutrinos are coupled to electrons and positrons. Basically, what I mean by early universe here, I mean around 110 MeV, okay? Okay, when the universe had this temperature, via the weak interaction processes. So you have, let me just write them down, neutrino, antineutrino. Okay, so this annihilation. And then you have the following. Go E plus minus plus. And then you have the scattering processes. So the question is the following. So they will be coupled to the plasma so long as, so the plasma, the rest, okay, of the universe, the photons, the baryons, okay, basically through electron and positrons, so long as these processes are efficient. And what do we mean by efficient? We mean the following. I can calculate a rate gamma for these processes. Okay, on the one end. On the other end, I can calculate what's the expansion rate, okay, of the universe, and this is age. And these processes will be efficient so long as the rate of collision is larger than the expansion rate. What do I mean? So long as there is at least one collision per Hubble time. Okay? Approximately how you define, whether collisions are in equilibrium or not. So if gamma is larger than the Hubble rate, then you're in equilibrium. And if gamma drops below the Hubble rate, then you go out of equilibrium. These equations go out of equilibrium. These reactions, sorry. So now, how can we estimate the rate gamma for these reactions? Since I consider temperature of order 1 to 10 MeV, which are much lower than the energy scale of electroweak symmetry breaking, which is around 100 GeV, I can use, the so-called 4 fermion theory of Fermi in order to describe, basically, to calculate the cross sections and calculate this rate. Okay? So since basically the temperature I'm considering is much, much smaller than the mass, if you want, of the W and the Z bosons, I can use, how is it called, 4 fermion? 4 fermion theory. So in this limit, what you find is that the cross-section sigma f for these different processes scale as the Fermi coupling constant to the square, okay, times the temperature to the square. Okay, so the Fermi coupling constant goes like 1 over the mass of these bosons to the square. So this goes like 1 over energy to the 4 times energy squared. So it goes like 1 over energy squared. So it goes like length squared. So it's a cross section. Makes sense. Okay. No surprise. Now, what you need, second ingredient, once you have the cross section to calculate a rate, you also need number density. Okay. So what's the number density of the particles that participate to this reaction? So how did I write it? So NF generically is going to be a function of T. Okay. So we have basically basically what you need to do here is just to sum up the number of degrees of freedom that you have here. So you have only relativistic fermions, right? So you have, for the electrons and positrons, you have 2 times 2 degrees of freedom, okay? They are spin 1/2 particles, okay? And then you have either an electron and a positron, okay? And then you have either left-handed or right-handed neutrinos, okay? But there are 3 families, so you have 3 times 2, so 10, okay? And then basically what you do is that you assume that all this is in thermal equilibrium, so you can use, thermal equilibrium expression, which is very convenient. So you find that for fermions, the number density of relativistic fermions is the following. So there is some factor of 3, 4, which comes again from the fact that you integrate over Fermi-Dirac distributions. And then you have some zeta function. Pi square, and then you have GF, okay, here, which is 10. And then it goes with, most importantly, it goes with the temperature to the cube, okay? And so if you put numbers, you get 1.3 times T cube, okay? I guess in units, probably in some units. Which I didn't work out here, okay? But what's the bottom line? The bottom line is that the rate, okay, the rate would basically go as NF times typically the average of the thermal cross section. You assume that V is of order unity, okay, relativistic particles, and you get something which goes like, so let me tell you what I find. So you get something with this which goes like GF squared times T to the 5. However, so all this, happens, I'm discussing this because I know that the decoupling occurs around 1 MeV, okay, I know it already. And at those temperatures, okay, the universe is dominated by radiation, and the bottom line is that the Hubble rate goes like the temperature square only. So clearly, as the universe expands, the rate of interaction will drop much faster than the rate of expansion. So I expect that at some point, the neutrinos will go out of equilibrium from the plasma, okay? And if you do the calculation, you find that this happens at a temperature of 1.4 MeV approximately. So the decoupling temperature is 1.4 MeV. Okay? So they decouple at 1.4 MeV from the plasma, and what is important is that for us is that they decouple before positron electron annihilation. So this is important for the calculation of the neutrino temperature. Because what will happen is the following. So on the one hand, so below 1.4 MeV, you basically have two sets of relativistic particles. Okay, on the one hand, you have the electron, positrons, and photon, which interact strongly. Okay, and then you have the neutrinos. Okay, here. And what will happen is that when the temperature reaches 0.5 MeV, which is the rest mass of electron and positron, then the latter will annihilate into photons, and so they will damp all their entropy into the photon bath. So the temperature of the photon will raise, but not that of the neutrinos, which are already decoupled from the plasma. Okay? So you expect that there will be a difference in temperature of photons and neutrinos at late time. Okay, so you calculate the temperature change as follows. So you use the fact that in the homogeneous and isotropic universe, the entropy per co-moving volume is conserved. Right? It's adiabatic expansion. And there are no internal dissipative processes. Okay, so what you need, what you will do is you will use this conservation of entropy or adiabatic expansion of the universe. So the first thing to do is to write down the entropy density for the electron, positron, and the photons. Okay. So generically, this goes as the following. So it goes like the temperature to the cube, okay, obviously to have like the conservation in a co-moving volume. And then there is this number of degrees of freedom, okay, which is a function of the temperature and which is defined as the sum of the contribution from bosons and fermions. Okay, so what we need to do is that, so Tx would be basically the temperature of each of these species, I mean, relative to what I called, I mean, Tx divided by T. Why did I write this? Because in principle, each PC could have the different temperature. The understanding is that T here, the reference temperature is the temperature of the photons. But for what we are, I mean, for our considerations here, the electron, positrons, and photons, they are strongly interacting, so they all have the same temperature. Okay? So I can just ignore these factors here. Okay? So this is just basically the sum of G for bosons plus 7, 8, the sum of G for fermions. Where again, G counts the number of degrees of freedom for each particle. Okay, so we need to calculate this G before and after the annihilation of electron positrons. So before G, before we have G star S. Okay, so we have So bosons, we have two, we have photons, right? So it's massless spin 1, so 2, okay, polarization. And then we have 7, 8 times 4 for the electron positrons spin 1/2, okay? So that gives me 11 divided by 2, okay? And then after, we are only left with photons, okay, after the annihilation, so it's 2, okay? And now, I use the fact that the entropy in a comoving volume is conserved. Okay, so what is this? So alternatively, I will compute it in the physical volume that kind of obviously expands with the universe, right? So it's going to go like, so there is this numerical factor of 2, whatever, pi squared divided by 45. I can just forget about it, okay, it's not important. So it's going to go as follows. So before the annihilation, the entropy in a certain comoving volume is the following. So AI is the scale factor just before electron-positron annihilation. Okay? That's the temperature before, and that's the number of degrees of freedom. And then this has to be equal to the same expression, but evaluated just after, but I wrote F, okay, initial, final. Right? Now if I assume, okay, in principle, if you have to go a bit through the details, right, it's not instantaneous, but if you assume that this happens nearly instantaneously, then then basically AI is AF, okay, so you can just drop these factors, okay, and so you get, then if you plug the right number of degrees of freedom, then you find that the final temperature is 11/4 of the initial temperature. Now, initially, the neutrinos had the same temperature as the photons, because although they were decoupled, the two temperature scales like 1/A. Okay, so Ti is basically the neutrino temperature. And then obviously Tf is now the photon temperature after electron-positron annihilation. So this shows that the ratio of the photon to neutrino temperature is actually greater than unity by this factor of this third root of 14/4. Okay. So what does this imply then for the ratio of the energy densities in photons and in neutrinos? Well, rho nu, rho gamma, and then it goes with this factor of 7, 8. It's a temperature to the 4, okay, so I need to raise this appropriately. And there is a number here of neutrino families, and so that gives 0.23 NU. So it's approximately 0.7. Okay, so it's not a big difference. The energy density in neutrinos is approximately 70% of that in the photons. So now we ask, okay, so what happened to these neutrinos? Okay, so they have decoupled from the plasma. We know that they have to the temperature which is lower than the temperature of the photons. So what happened to the homogeneous and isotropic distribution once they have decoupled? And this we already know from our discussion during the previous hour. So we know that at the background level, we know that their distribution will evolve according to, well, the zeroth order Boltzmann equation, okay, which is basically the collisionless Liouville equation. And so we have it's known as collisionless Liouville equation. And so in the right-hand side, no collisions. On the left-hand side, you only have these two terms because, obviously, the point is that the homogeneous and isotropic distribution function of the neutrinos goes as Fermi-Dirac with P divided by T nu plus 1. So here again, the distribution function of the neutrinos retains its shape. The only change is the redshift of the neutrino momenta. As I told you, I mean, we didn't do the calculation, but this redshift of momenta, I mean, is applied. It's not only for massless, but it's also for massive particles, okay? But what is important is that this distribution function, it's relativistic Fermi-Dirac and relativistic Fermi-Dirac distribution, and it will always retain its relativistic Fermi-Dirac shape, even if later the neutrinos become basically non-relativistic because they actually have a non-zero mass. Okay? So it will never go to a Maxwell-Boltzmann distribution. That's what I mean. Okay? That cannot be. That cannot happen. Okay? Just a bit lost with the blackboard. So, let's now discuss a bit more. So what happened to this background of relic and possibly massive neutrinos? So after the decoupling, after the neutrino decoupled, so from the plasma, their density is conserved, okay? So it goes like a to the minus 3. That's the first thing for sure. And then their phase space distribution retain the Fermi-Dirac form at all time. Relativistic Fermi-Dirac. And here again, So this distribution is parameterized by a temperature, which we know what it is, okay? We know that this temperature is only 411, 1/3 of the photon temperature. But again, as I said before, it's not a real thermodynamic equilibrium temperature. It's just a parameter at this level because there is no thermodynamic equilibrium. There are no interactions, okay? It just parameterizes basically the distribution function of the neutrinos. So one can look at it as like an effective temperature. Effective neutrino temperature. And so what I can do is that I can still, even if the neutrino become massive, well, I can still use this effective neutrino temperature that scales as 1/A to describe what their distribution function is doing, okay? So I will basically define a certain neutrino temperature. Okay, what would be the the effective neutrino temperature today is basically T nu times A, okay? With the understanding that it's an effective temperature which parameterizes this relativistic Fermi-Dirac distribution, which retains its shape always at all time. So once basically T nu 0, which is, so it's 411 1/3 of T gamma 0. So once T nu 0 divided by A drops below the mass of the neutrinos, I will assume that they have all the same mass, okay? For simplicity, that's not the case actually, okay? But just for the sake of doing this calculation, just now. Then you need to calculate the density and pressure of this neutrino background as follows. So the neutrino energy density will be given by the sum over the 3 neutrino families. So you have this factor of 2 because you have left-handed and right-handed antiparticle, okay? This factor of 2 pi cube, integral dp, and then you do the integral over the angles p squared, and now you need to put the energy, and you need to take into account the fact that they have a mass, okay? So the energy is the physical momentum, p squared, plus the mass of the neutrino, okay? Which now they could be different because I do this sum separately, okay? But just the criterion here, I mean, of course, you would have to check it for each neutrino separately, okay? I didn't care about that, okay? At times, the neutrino distribution function, so it's a function of A and P. But what is really important is that it is the relativistic Fermi-Dirac distribution which it got at the time of decoupling because the shape remains the same. So this is EAP divided by T nu 0 plus 1. Okay, that's one of the, I guess, the most important point is that even if the neutrinos become non-relativistic at late time, you still have to use this relativistic Fermi-Dirac distribution when you do the calculation. Okay, otherwise it would give completely inconsistent results. Yeah? It never goes to a Maxwell-Boltzmann. And then the same for the pressure. So for the pressure, that's what you get. So you have two relativistic expressions, so that would give you the factor of 1/3 from the averaging of momenta. But now, obviously, there is a correction because they can become non-relativistic. So in this case, basically what you have, you multiply by p squared and by the square root of p squared plus m nu squared. Okay, that's what enters the contribution. That's what enters the integral when you calculate the pressure. And then again, you have this relativistic Fermi-Dirac distribution here. Maybe one thing, yeah, there is one thing which so here, by the way, you see there is, I was discussing the chemical potential of the photons, so maybe I should have said, so what about the neutrinos? Well, in principle, they could have non-zero chemical potential. What would this imply? This would imply that basically there is a different amount of neutrinos and antineutrinos. But we have really no way of measuring it, because we cannot, at the moment at least, measure this neutrino background, so we don't know. Okay? But in principle, that could be the case. But the lepton number, anyway, of the universe is not known, so it's completely... At this level, we just assume that there is zero chemical potential. Okay, so then we are... okay, from this we can calculate. So you use this expression and you can calculate the present day energy density of neutrinos. Okay, and you can translate this into a density parameter, omega nu, and this omega nu, if you do the calculation, it's the sum of the neutrino masses divided by 93.6 little h squared electron volt. Okay? So now I will just say a few words about just to start the discussion of neutrino perturbation. Do you have any question about this? Or I guess most of you already covered this material. But, so the bottom line here is the following. Once the neutrino, they decouple from the plasma at 1.4 MeV, they become collisionless. Which means that, I mean, their mean free path can be, arbitrarily large. It just depends on the age of the universe. So the bottom line is that for neutrinos, again, as for photons, you need to go to the Boltzmann equation. Okay, in order to describe the evolution of their distribution function. The only difference is that it's collisionless. They are collisionless, so there is no collision term. But there is still a collisionless Boltzmann equation, Vlasov equation, which you need to solve. So again, if you do all, basically you can redo the calculation we did for the neutrinos. I mean, defining a neutrino perturbation in a similar, in a way similar to the CMB temperature perturbation. And so, in analogy with the photons, so you defined the neutrino distribution function at first order as the homogeneous and isotropic solution minus, here again I do the same, P, where P is the physical momentum, dF nu dP times N. And N would be the equivalent of the fractional perturbation to the neutrino temperature. Effective temperature. So N is a function, again, of eta what did I want to do? K and N as one goes to Fourier space. So then you will get a hierarchy of coupled differential equations, which is basically the same as the Boltzmann hierarchy for photons. So what I want to do, but what I will do next, because I didn't appreciate the fact that I would go so fast, maybe too fast. So what I will do tomorrow, I want to show you how. Okay, so basically, if we do this calculation, we will end up with multiples. Okay, we will end up with multiples. Okay, so there is the monopole. Okay, dipole, and then there is also a quadrupole, etc. Okay. So when we discuss the photons, right? I told you I told you what this quadrupole represents physically, right? So the same applies here for neutrinos. Okay, it's the fact that I sit at a certain position in space, okay, and I observe the neutrino distribution function around me. And if the neutrino mean-free path is long, I will start superposing streams of neutrinos coming from relatively distant regions that could have different effective temperature. Okay, and this superposition of streams of neutrinos with different temperature, they will induce a quadrupole, okay, as seen by a local observer. Okay, and this quadrupole is basically its viscosity, friction, but I mean it would be like gas friction. Okay, here is the fact that I can start transferring neutrinos, for instance, with higher momenta from hotter regions into regions of colder temperature. Okay, it's really like friction, but it's friction for a gas. Okay, so clearly the neutrino quadrupole is also, is directly connected to a neutrino shear viscosity. And so what I want to do, basically, I will do it tomorrow. What I want to do is to show you that, to start with, is to show you that this quadrupole is basically, if I look now at neutrinos as an effective fluid, okay, so I write down the energy momentum tensor of neutrinos as like the perfect fluid plus, corrections which describe these imperfections. Then this corresponds to a term which is really like a shear viscosity in this energy momentum tensor. So I will do that tomorrow, and then we will gradually move to large-scale structure, and at the end discuss, okay, what's the impact of neutrinos in large-scale structure? Okay. Yes.